On the dawn of May 19, 1536, a grey sky settled over the Tower of London. Mist curled around a scaffold of pale wood, lower than usual, foreign in design. A French executioner prepared his sword with calm precision. Word spread quickly through the gathering crowd. A queen would die that day. For the first time in English history, the crown had turned on itself. The Queen's resolve. Inside the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn stirred from a restless sleep. 17 days had passed since her arrest, and each had chipped away at her comfort, but not her composure. Though the weight of betrayal and impending death loomed over her, Anne remained poised, her posture still regal. She was only 35, but those who saw her noted how little the ordeal had dulled her presence. Her grace was undiminished. Her few remaining ladies-in-waiting, hearts heavy, assisted her in dressing for the final time. Anne had selected her attire with precision and purpose. She donned a dark gray mantle lined with fur, somber yet stately. Beneath it, a crimson bodice, the color of sacrifice and silent resistance, chosen not only for its symbolism, but also for its practicality. It would not show the blood. The chamber was silent, save for the rustle of fabric and the quiet weeping of her attendants. Anne's composure remained intact. With a touch of gallows humor, she gently fingered her slender neck and remarked, "I have a little neck." Her voice was steady, her irony biting yet graceful. Those present were struck not only by her words, but by the courage they veiled. In those final moments of preparation, Anne was not merely a condemned woman. She was a queen. She faced her fate without bitterness, wrapping herself in dignity as much as in her chosen garments. Her silence was filled with strength, her elegance a quiet rebellion against the injustice awaiting her, a mind shaped in France. Anne Boleyn's formative years were spent immersed in the glittering world of the French court, a place where art, diplomacy, and culture flourished under the Renaissance spirit. As a young lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, Anne was more than an observer. She was a participant in the elegance and intellectualism that defined the French nobility. She became fluent in French, gained a sharp understanding of court politics, and was exposed to humanist ideas that would shape her reformist leanings later in life. Though she did not fit the era's conventional ideals of beauty, her olive skin, dark eyes, and black hair diverged from the celebrated pale golden standard. Anne possessed a magnetic presence. She carried herself with confidence and sharp wit, drawing admiration from all corners of the court. Her education in music, literature, and theology added to her allure. Those who met her noted the unique blend of sophistication and spirited independence that made her unforgettable. Upon her return to England in the early 1520s, Anne quickly became a distinctive figure at court. She stood apart in a society where noble women were expected to be passive and ornamental. Her eloquence and decisiveness challenged those norms. When Henry VIII began to pursue her, she stood firm against his advances. Unlike her sister Mary, who had been the king's mistress, Anne refused to give in. "If you want me," she made clear, "you must make me queen." With that bold statement, she altered the course of English history forever. The gamble that changed a nation. To win Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII was willing to risk everything: his marriage, his legitimacy, and his nation's religious unity. His obsession with her became the catalyst for England's dramatic split from the Catholic Church. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry defied the papacy. With Parliament's backing, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This seismic decision changed not only Anne's fate, but the spiritual and political course of an entire country. Henry and Anne married in secret in January 1533, and Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony shortly thereafter. Later that year, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The child's arrival was met not with celebration but with disappointment. Henry had longed for a son. Still, Anne held her head high, believing future pregnancies would secure her position. However, Anne's subsequent pregnancies ended in tragedy. She suffered multiple miscarriages, including the loss of a male fetus in early 1536. Each loss chipped away at her influence, weakening her standing in court and with the king. At the same time, Anne's assertive nature, reformist views, and refusal to fade into the background created powerful enemies. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who saw Anne's fall as both politically expedient and personally advantageous. Once Henry's affection cooled and his hopes for a male heir waned, Anne became vulnerable. A web of conspiracies was spun. What had begun as a passionate love affair that reshaped a kingdom now set the stage for betrayal and tragedy. Anne, once the symbol of transformation, became the target of political elimination. The Queen on trial, Anne was arrested in early May 1536 under a storm of scandalous accusations. She was charged with adultery with 5 men, one of whom was her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges extended further, accusing her of conspiring to murder the king and committing treason against the crown. These accusations were not only absurd in nature, but they also reeked of political orchestration and vengeance. Anne, who had once stood at the pinnacle of English nobility, was now caught in a vicious web of courtly intrigue. Stripped of power and support, she was afforded none of the protections traditionally extended to royalty. She was denied legal counsel. The accused were denied the chance to confront their accusers. The so-called witnesses remained nameless and unseen. The outcome had been decided before the trial began. Anne was to be made an example. The trial was held in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, a place that once resonated with celebration and splendor, now echoing with whispered betrayals. Despite the enormity of the charges and the hostile court stacked against her, Anne defended herself with unflinching dignity. Her voice was steady, her words chosen with intelligence and restraint. Observers noted her composure and grace, remarking that she seemed more angel than woman. Anne's performance in court did little to change her fate, but it left a mark. Even in the face of orchestrated ruin, she maintained her queenly presence. She did not plead, did not weep. She stood firm, embodying the strength of a woman determined to face the injustice hurled upon her with unwavering courage. Though the verdict was already written, Anne's legacy was beginning to be etched in a different kind of stone, one of memory, resilience, and quiet defiance. The sentence. Despite her stirring and dignified defense, Anne Boleyn was found guilty of the charges laid against her. The verdict, a foregone conclusion from the moment her enemies initiated the charges, was announced with grim finality. According to the law of the realm, a woman convicted of treason was to suffer death by burning, a horrifying fate meant to terrify and disgrace. But King Henry VIII, still mindful of international perception and perhaps moved by a flicker of his former affection, intervened. He commuted Anne's sentence to death by beheading. This alteration was portrayed as an act of mercy, yet in truth, it was also a strategic decision, ensuring a swifter, cleaner execution with less public spectacle. Moreover, the king ordered that a specialist swordsman be brought from France, renowned for his skill and precision, rather than relying on the traditional English axe. The summoning of a foreign executioner was a rare and unusual choice. It indicated both a desire for a more honorable death and a calculated attempt to avoid a botched execution that might stir public sympathy. The court buzzed with whispers of the planned spectacle, and Anne herself was informed of the change. To those around her, she accepted the news with the same calm strength that had defined her recent days. Though spared the pyre, Anne was not spared the cruelty of anticipation. The preparations for the execution continued with quiet efficiency, the tower's stones bearing silent witness to the final moments of a queen whose rise had reshaped a kingdom and whose fall would become legend. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn awoke prepared to face her final hour. Her composure was remarkable as she dressed quietly with her attendants. But just as she had come to peace with her fate, a messenger arrived with cruel news. Her execution had been postponed until noon. The delay was no mercy. It was an added torment. Each hour stretched endlessly, heavy with sorrow and dread. Anne spent the time in solemn prayer. She took communion and whispered her innocence, not for her accusers, but to the God she trusted to judge her soul. "For my salvation," she said, "I am clear of what I am condemned for." Her ladies struggled to hold back tears. In a final gesture of grace, Anne turned to them. not in despair, but in quiet gratitude. She offered a parting token to each, a small item of personal meaning. More than gifts, they were a legacy of courage. As noon approached, the muffled thud of drums began to echo beyond the stone walls. Anne stood, calm and composed. "Remember me," she told her ladies, "and how I end." There was no bitterness in her voice, only dignity, carried on the breath of a dying queen. The final walk. Fewer than 1,000 people had gathered in the courtyard of the Tower of London. The air was heavy, charged with a strange and somber reverence, quite unlike the usual bloodthirsty anticipation of an execution. Even the most curious onlookers removed their hats as Anne Boleyn stepped into view. She wore the same dignified ensemble she had chosen with such care, gray and crimson, colors that spoke of mourning, power, and concealed sacrifice. Her poise stunned the crowd. She was every inch a queen. She moved with calm deliberation toward the scaffold, her steps graceful and unhurried. Though death awaited her, she held herself as if walking toward a coronation rather than an execution. The clamor of the crowd gave way to an unnatural silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of her dress brushing the wood and the distant toll of church bells. Once on the platform, Anne was granted the right to speak. She turned to the crowd, her voice strong and clear. She made no protestations of innocence, nor did she accuse those who had betrayed her. Instead, she praised the king, her former husband, the man who had condemned her. It was a brilliant political maneuver, one final gesture of loyalty to protect the fragile future of her daughter, Elizabeth. Her speech was short, but it echoed deeply. Those present would never forget her bearing, her words, or the courage that radiated from her in that final moment. Even facing death, Anne Boleyn managed to command respect. Her final walk was not one of defeat, but of defiance cloaked in grace. In the eyes of history, that walk would become a lasting testament to the inner strength of a woman who refused to be broken. The execution. As the execution hour struck, Anne Boleyn stepped onto the scaffold with unwavering grace. She stood for a moment, taking in the scene, not with fear, but with solemn understanding. In the eyes of the crowd, she was a figure both royal and tragically human. Every gesture she made was deliberate, filled with quiet dignity. She removed her mantle and cap, revealing her long dark hair and the crimson bodice beneath. Her hands did not tremble as she handed the executioner a small purse filled with gold coins, a final act of regal composure, a payment to the man about to end her life. It was not only custom, but a mark of respect for skill. She had heard of his precision, and she wished for a swift death. With no wooden block to rest upon, Anne knelt upright, as was the French custom for beheadings by sword. Her posture was straight, her eyes closed, her lips in silent prayer. One of her faithful ladies stepped forward and gently tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne murmured her final words, "Lord Jesus, receive my soul. O God, have pity on my soul." The executioner, following French tradition, used a psychological trick to distract her. "Where is my sword?" he asked aloud, though he already held it hidden behind him. Anne instinctively turned her head slightly. In that moment, with a single fluid motion, the sword fell. Her head separated cleanly from her body. A stunned silence gripped the crowd. The executioner lifted her head high and declared her a traitor. But there was no roar, no triumph, only a ripple of murmured disquiet. In that instant, England had lost a queen and gained a martyr. The aftermath. The moment Anne Boleyn's head fell, a cannon thundered from the tower. The report echoed across the Thames, carried swiftly to Whitehall where Henry VIII awaited confirmation. That sound signaled not only Anne's death, but the king's newfound freedom. The very next day, Henry became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 10 days, they were married, a swift and calculated transition that left no space for mourning. Back at the Tower, Anne's body was treated with shocking indifference. There was no coffin prepared, no royal rites for the woman who had once worn the crown of England. Her attendants, heartbroken and dazed, did what they could. With no other recourse, the guards retrieved an old arrow chest. Anne's body, along with her severed head, was laid inside. The crude box was carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where it was buried beneath the stone floor in an unmarked grave. No inscription honored her. No monument marked her name. Henry's campaign to erase Anne's legacy began immediately. Her portraits were torn down and destroyed. Her personal emblems, most notably the white falcon, were removed from court and palace. Her initials were chiseled away from stone and woodwork. Her name was omitted from records, a brutal act of damnatio memoriae, an ancient practice of erasing someone from collective memory. But history would not comply. Though Henry tried to reduce Anne to silence and shadow, the echoes of her voice, her wit, her influence, her defiance lingered. Her erasure became its own indictment, a quiet confession of how deeply she had once mattered. In attempting to bury her legacy, Henry inadvertently ensured it would rise. The Queen reborn. Yet, Henry VIII failed to erase Anne Boleyn entirely. Her legacy endured, quiet and persistent, growing in the hearts of those who remembered her intellect, her reformist spirit, and the injustice of her death. 23 years after her execution, the woman Henry had once dismissed for giving him a daughter was vindicated when that very daughter, Elizabeth, ascended the English throne. Crowned in 1558, Elizabeth I inherited a kingdom racked by religious division and political uncertainty. Yet, from the outset, she demonstrated the shrewdness, poise, and resilience reminiscent of her mother. Her reign would span 45 years and come to be known as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a time of flourishing culture, exploration, and relative stability. Elizabeth's rule was marked by calculated independence. She never married, famously declaring herself wed to her kingdom. This choice, both political and personal, echoed Anne's defiance of traditional roles and dependence. Elizabeth surrounded herself with capable advisors but trusted her own judgment most. Like Anne, she possessed an incisive mind, a commanding presence, and the ability to navigate a court filled with intrigue. Though she rarely spoke publicly of her mother, Elizabeth's actions reflected deep reverence. She reinstated symbols Anne once cherished, including the white falcon emblem. She also appointed many of Anne's former allies to positions of influence. Through this subtle restoration, Elizabeth reclaimed her mother's memory from disgrace and elevated it into something enduring. In Elizabeth's reign, the daughter fulfilled what the mother had only begun. Where Anne had sparked transformation, Elizabeth solidified it. The daughter of a condemned queen became one of England's greatest monarchs. And through her, Anne Boleyn lived again, not as a fallen consort, but as a queen reborn in legacy and strength. During chapel renovations in 1876, bones were found, likely Anne's, and quietly reburied with dignity. Today, a simple glass marker stands on the tower lawn. Each year, roses are laid in her memory. Anne Boleyn became more than a tragic queen. She became a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice, of the risks borne by powerful women, and of how memory endures where monuments do not. Her triumph came not through vindication in her own lifetime, but through her daughter. Elizabeth embraced the white falcon once erased from palace walls and ruled the very kingdom that had taken her mother's life. Anne Boleyn's fall was brutal and deliberate, but it was not the end. In the quiet persistence of legacy, she rose, uninvited, unforgotten. Long before his name was immortalized in legend and film, William Wallace was a man of flesh and blood, driven by vengeance, honor, and a burning desire for freedom. In a time when Scotland groaned beneath the iron fist of English rule, Wallace rose as an unexpected leader. Not a king, not a nobleman, but a warrior forged by loss and conflict. His actions stirred fear in his enemies, hope in his people, and fury in the crown. To the English, he was a traitor. To the Scots, a hero. But no matter how he is remembered, his end remains one of the most brutal and symbolic executions in British history. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was executed in London, not in silence, not with dignity, but in the most horrific way imaginable, mutilated, tortured, and torn apart. His death was meant to crush. Instead, it inspired. This is no ordinary story. This is a chronicle of resistance, betrayal, and vengeance. A journey to the edge of human cruelty, and the beginning of a legend that never died. In the rugged Scottish landscape of the late 13th century, William Wallace was born, not heir to a throne, but to a resistance that had simmered for generations. His youth was marked by English occupation, oppression, and the death of his father, killed in battle against English forces. Wallace grew up with hatred in his heart and fire in his blood. No formal education in courtly manners or politics. His training ground was the wild, the sword, and the sight of his people broken under foreign rule. What silenced others ignited a storm within him. It wasn't ambition that drove him, it was loss. Legend says the murder of his beloved by English soldiers was the final spark. Wallace took up the sword and never laid it down. What began as a local act of vengeance grew into a rebellion. He attacked garrisons, raided posts, and showed no mercy to English soldiers. His name spread like wildfire, a name that sowed fear among oppressors and lit hope among the oppressed. On September 11th, 1297, England faced a man they could no longer ignore. Wallace, now leader of the Scottish rebels, stood with his forces at the River Forth, near Stirling. Across the bridge, an English army, superior in numbers and weaponry. But Wallace did not fight with numbers. He fought with insight, terrain, and the fury of a people done kneeling. As the English army crossed the narrow bridge, Wallace gave the order. In the chaos, their strength became their downfall. The English were cut off, driven into the water, slaughtered. What began as an act of desperation became a legendary victory. The Battle of Stirling Bridge transformed Wallace from rebel to symbol, guardian of Scotland. For the first time in years, Scotland stood not beneath, but face to face with the English crown, head held high. Wallace had sent a message, not in words, but in blood. Scotland would not submit. In the aftermath of Stirling, Wallace was no longer just a warrior. He was a legend in motion. Hailed as the savior of Scotland, he was declared guardian of the realm in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. But with that title came a new battlefield, not one of blades, but of politics. Wallace was a man of action, not of courtly games. He led with conviction but lacked noble lineage. Among the Scottish elite, his rise was met with resistance, envy, and quiet disdain. They needed his victories but questioned his right to lead. Still, Wallace pushed forward. He invaded northern England, torching towns and instilling fear far beyond the border. It was not mere vengeance, it was strategy. A message carved in fire. Scotland would strike back. But with power came pressure. The fractured nobility, ever shifting in loyalty, began to falter. Whispers of doubt crept into the ranks. Wallace had become the face of the rebellion, and the crown's most wanted man. The rebel had gained a throne without a crown, and enemies without borders. On July 22nd, 1298, the dream of a free Scotland met the full force of English retaliation. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, personally led his army north. Wallace, undeterred, gathered what forces he could. He knew what was coming. He stood anyway. The field of Falkirk would be his crucible. Wallace positioned his troops in tight schiltron formations, circles of spearmen designed to withstand cavalry. For hours, the Scots held. But the English had a secret weapon, longbowmen. Arrow after arrow rained down, breaking the formations, tearing through flesh and morale. Then came the final blow, not from the English, but from within. The Scottish nobility, resentful or afraid, withdrew their cavalry, abandoning Wallace to the slaughter. It wasn't just a defeat, it was betrayal. Wallace escaped with his life, but not his title. He resigned as guardian, disappearing into shadow, a hunted man once more. Falkirk marked the end of his command, but not his cause. The hammer had struck, but the fire still smoldered. After Falkirk, Wallace became a ghost. vanishing into forests, mountains, and whispers. Still, he remained a symbol, a threat. The English scoured the highlands in search of him, and the bounty on his head grew with every passing season. But Wallace's fall would not come at the hands of English steel. It came from within. In 1305, Wallace was betrayed by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith, a noble aligned with the English crown. Whether for coin, favor, or fear, Menteith lured Wallace into a trap near Glasgow. There were no warnings, no final words, just shackles, silence, and the sudden weight of betrayal. Captured not by an enemy, but by a countryman, Wallace faced the deepest wound of all, abandonment by the land he fought to free. Scotland did not weep. The nobles remained quiet. The people, powerless. Wallace, the warrior who dared to rise, had been delivered into the hands of his enemy. Not defeated in battle, but in trust. Once bound, Wallace was paraded south like a trophy, not as a prisoner of war, but as a symbol of humiliation. His journey to London was long, deliberate, and cruel. He was dragged through towns, mocked by crowds, pelted with filth. In chains, stripped of dignity, he became a walking lesson in obedience, a warning etched in flesh. The English did not rush his punishment. They relished it. Wallace was kept in the Tower of London, isolated, watched, and broken down, not by pain, but by silence. No trial awaited him, only a performance. Word spread quickly. The rebel had been caught. The man who had once scorched the English countryside now stood alone, exhausted, betrayed, and condemned. But he never begged. He never bent the knee. Even in chains, Wallace walked like a man unbroken. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was dragged in chains to Westminster Hall, the heart of English law, though the proceedings to follow bore no trace of justice. It was not a trial, but a display, a public humiliation carefully staged for the crown and the people. Wallace stood before his enemies, proud but wounded, a shadow of the warrior he once was, yet unbroken in spirit. He was charged with treason, murder, and rebellion against King Edward I. But Wallace answered with fire in his voice, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." His words cut through the silence, the final resistance of a man who would not yield. He was given no lawyer, no defense, no witnesses were heard. The verdict had already been decided long before he entered the hall. For the English, the trial was theater. For Wallace, it was a formality before execution. His defiance, however, refused to die. Even in the face of certain death, he denied their authority, and with that, denied them full victory. The court condemned him, the people watched, but the man on trial became a legend the moment he spoke. The sentence passed upon William Wallace was not one of justice. It was a carefully crafted message. The verdict had never been in doubt. The English crown had decided his fate long before his trial began. What remained was the spectacle. Wallace was condemned to suffer the full punishment reserved for traitors, the most brutal and symbolic execution England could devise. First, he would be hanged, dragged through the streets and suspended by the neck, but not until death. He would be cut down alive, gasping for breath as the true torment began. Next came the castration, followed by disembowelment, his internal organs pulled from his body while he still breathed. They were to be burned in front of him, a ritual of pain and humiliation. Only then would he be beheaded, his suffering finally brought to an end. But death was not the end. His body would be quartered, torn into 4 parts and sent to the farthest reaches of the kingdom, to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, as a warning to all who might rise against the crown. This was not merely execution, it was terror, made flesh, and it ensured Wallace's death would echo far beyond the scaffold. The streets of London stirred before dawn. The air was thick with anticipation, not of celebration, but of punishment. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was brought from the Tower of London, chained, gaunt, yet unbroken. What followed was not an execution, it was an ordeal. He was tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the filthy streets for miles to Smithfield, jeered and pelted by the crowds. There, in front of a bloodthirsty audience, the sentence was carried out. A ritual of horror. First, he was hanged, his body convulsing as life tried to escape. But death was not allowed. He was cut down alive, barely conscious. Then came the knife, castration, followed by the slow removal of his intestines. Witnesses say he remained awake as his organs were burned before his eyes. Finally, he was beheaded. His pain ended, his legacy born. But his death did not conclude the punishment. His limbs were severed, each piece soaked in blood and sealed for transport. Wallace's execution was designed not only to kill the man, but to terrify a nation. What the English didn't realize was that in trying to destroy a rebel, they had forged a martyr. When Wallace's broken body collapsed, the sentence had only just begun. His head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike atop London Bridge, where it stared down at all who passed. A grim warning from the crown. His limbs were sent across the kingdom, one to Newcastle, another to Berwick, a third to Stirling, and the last to Perth. Hung above gates, rotting in the wind, they were intended to instill fear, to remind the people what defiance would cost. But the message backfired. Instead of terror, his dismembered body became a symbol. In whispers and secret toasts, in legends passed from father to son, Wallace lived on. His story could not be quartered, his courage could not be burned. To the English, he was reduced to bone and blood. To the Scots, he became immortal. The body was destroyed, but the idea survived. Of a man who stood against an empire, who chose agony over submission. His limbs were scattered, but his name grew louder. William Wallace died a traitor's death. But he rose, in legend, in spirit, in history, as a patriot whose execution gave birth to a nation's voice. William Wallace died in agony, his body broken, scattered, erased, or so the English thought. But death could not silence what he had come to represent. In the years following his execution, his name only grew, whispered in taverns, sung in rebel songs, etched into the soul of Scotland. He became more than a man. He became a symbol. Wallace's life, marked by defiance, betrayal, and brutal sacrifice, forged the heart of a national identity. He stood not as a king or a noble, but as a man of the people, a voice for the voiceless, a sword for the broken. He embodied a dream the Scots would never again forget. That freedom was worth dying for. His memory inspired generations. From Robert the Bruce's eventual victory at Bannockburn to modern movements for independence. Monuments were raised, films were made, and in every tale, the cry remained the same. You may take our lives, but you'll never take our freedom. Wallace's echo still lives, not in flesh, but in fire. In the land he died for, and in the people who still speak his name with pride. A rebel, a martyr, a patriot, and Scotland's eternal guardian of liberty. The man once called England's Golden Prince died a rotting, bloated shadow of his former self. His legs were so ulcerated that pus soaked through his bandages daily. The smell of decay followed him into every room. He couldn't walk, couldn't ride, couldn't even stand without help. Servants carried him in custom-made chairs. His once charming smile had twisted into a permanent scowl. This was Henry VIII at the end, feared, avoided, and physically falling apart. But he hadn't always been this way. In his youth, Henry had everything. He wasn't born to be king. That role belonged to his older brother, Arthur. But fate handed him the crown at just 17. He was tall, athletic, strikingly handsome. He could ride, hunt, dance, compose music, debate scholars, and charm any court in Europe. He was, for a brief moment, the embodiment of promise. The people loved him. Nobles praised him. Foreign ambassadors sent home glowing reports. Henry VIII was to be the perfect Renaissance king. But the rot began early, not just in his body, but in his mind. A need for control, an obsession with legacy, paranoia, rage. As the years passed, the golden glow dimmed, and then something happened that accelerated the fall. This story isn't about a hero or a villain. It's about transformation, decay, the slow collapse of a king whose body and soul crumbled before his nation's eyes. This is the story of how the Golden Prince became the monstrous king, and it starts not with triumph, but with rot. Imagine a warm summer day in 1536, the air buzzing with excitement and anticipation. The grand tilt yard of Greenwich Palace is alive with the sounds of trumpets, cheering crowds, and the clatter of hooves against the packed earth. England's nobility has gathered to witness a magnificent jousting tournament, an event fit for kings and knights, a spectacle of bravery, skill, and honor. At the center of it all is Henry VIII, the larger-than-life king known across Europe for his fiery red beard, towering stature, and imposing presence. Only in his mid-40s, Henry is no longer the lithe, athletic prince of his youth, but he still carries himself with the confidence and swagger of a man who rules one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. Today, Henry isn't just watching from the sidelines. He's participating, as was his custom, charging into battle atop his favored horse, lance aimed forward, eyes blazing with fierce determination. Jousting is more than a sport to Henry. It is a declaration of power, a vivid reminder to all who watch that he is England's mightiest ruler, unchallenged in strength and spirit. But fate has other plans. As Henry's horse gallops full tilt toward his opponent, the ground beneath them shifts in an instant. Perhaps a rut or a patch of uneven turf, something unseen in the chaos of the tournament, causes the horse to stumble. Suddenly, the powerful animal pitches forward and crashes violently to the ground. In that terrifying moment, Henry is thrown from his saddle, the world spinning beneath him. His legs buckle awkwardly beneath the weight of his own body and the crashing horse. The impact is devastating. Henry's leg is caught beneath the enormous bulk of his horse, and a sickening snap echoes through the crowd. Bone breaks, flesh tears. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. The crowd, once roaring with excitement, falls into stunned silence. Courtiers, nobles, and commoners alike hold their breath as men rush to the fallen king's side. Henry lies on the ground, gasping, his face pale and slick with sweat. The proud warrior who once led armies and hunted with unparalleled vigor is now helpless, crushed beneath his own mount. Doctors and attendants swarm the scene. There's talk of broken bones, perhaps a shattered femur or tibia. The injury is severe, but in an age before modern medicine, the true danger lies not in the break itself, but in what comes next. The wound is open and deep. The risk of infection, of gangrene setting in, is terrifyingly high. Medicine in the 16th century is primitive. Treatments are crude, and hospitals are places many fear to enter. Henry is carried back to his chambers. The king, who once strode through his palaces like a god, is now confined to bed, his once powerful leg encased in splints, throbbing with pain. This accident, though seemingly a single moment in time, marks a turning point, not just for Henry VIII, but for the entire English realm. From this day forward, Henry's health would decline, his mobility diminish, and his temperament darken. The accident would haunt him physically and mentally, shaping the final years of his reign. It would change everything. The accident was just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Henry VIII for the rest of his life. In the days and weeks after that fateful fall, the king's injuries turned from painful to perilous. The broken leg, trapped under the weight of his massive horse, did not heal as anyone had hoped. Instead, it became infected. In a time before antibiotics or antiseptics, infections like this were often death sentences. Flesh would rot away, wounds would fester, and the stench of decay filled the air. For Henry, the wound turned into a grotesque, festering ulcer. His doctors tried everything: poultices, herbal salves, bloodletting, but the infection only spread deeper and deeper. The king's leg became swollen, purple, and blackened in places. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the agony was the humiliation. Imagine a king who once strode through his castles with power and grace, now confined to a chamber, unable to walk without assistance, his skin breaking down, the stench of decay surrounding him. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. Rumors spread like wildfire through the palace. The mighty Henry was becoming a prisoner of his own body, a rotting king, slowly succumbing to infection. But Henry's temperament would not allow him to be defeated so easily. Despite the unbearable pain, he demanded to be seen as strong. He insisted on continuing to rule, issuing orders from his bed, commanding his council with an iron will. His pride, however, masked a growing darkness. The king grew irritable, suspicious, and cruel. The pain made him volatile, and the fear of losing control consumed him. Every day was a battle, not just with his body, but with the creeping sense that he was no longer the invincible monarch he once was. In the quiet hours of the night, when the servants left him alone with his thoughts and the seeping wound, Henry faced the terrifying reality. His body was failing him. The rotting king was no longer just a metaphor. It was a dreadful truth. This infection was more than a physical curse. It became a symbol of the decay spreading through Henry's reign. The breakdown of alliances, the crumbling of relationships, and the storm brewing within the heart of England itself. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was a prisoner of his own body. His once formidable frame, broad-shouldered and agile, had become an unmanageable bulk. His waist reportedly measured over 50 inches. His leg, plagued by a recurring ulcer, constantly oozed pus and blood. The wound emitted a smell so putrid that some courtiers found excuses to avoid being in his presence for too long. Dressing him was a daily ordeal, requiring layers of padding, bandaging, and manpower. Walking was no longer an option. Even standing became dangerous. He was carried in reinforced chairs or moved on wheeled platforms. Rooms were rearranged to reduce the need for movement. His world shrank to accommodate his limbs, his wound, his weight. But his authority did not shrink with it. If anything, it intensified. The less he could move, the more brutal he became. Ministers were dismissed at the flick of a finger. Former confidants were condemned by signature alone. He didn't need to stand to execute power. He only needed a quill. Pain did not humble him. It hardened him. He blamed others for his suffering. He accused doctors of incompetence. He resented young courtiers for their strength. Even his closest companions approached with caution. A wrong word, a failed answer, a glance that lingered too long on his leg. Any of these could end in disgrace or death. Yet Henry maintained the illusion of kingship. Public appearances were carefully staged. Curtains concealed his entrance. Elaborate thrones disguised his inability to stand. When ambassadors visited, the king remained seated, towering in presence if not in posture. What remained of Henry VIII was no longer regal, but absolute. His stillness became menacing. He was a man who ruled not in motion, but by gravity alone. A mass no one dared challenge, and no one could truly approach. With his body betraying him and his movements painfully limited, Henry VIII's physical decline quickly began to shape the very atmosphere of his court. What was once a vibrant center of celebration, politics, and grandeur slowly transformed into something far darker, a palace ruled by fear. Imagine walking through the grand halls of Hampton Court or Whitehall Palace during these later years of Henry's reign. The tapestries still hung on the walls, the chandeliers still gleamed, but there was a chill in the air, an unspoken tension that made even the bravest courtiers tread carefully. Henry's fiery temper, once tempered by youth and ambition, had grown sharper and more unpredictable. The pain from his leg, combined with his frustration at his failing health, made him quick to anger and prone to sudden outbursts. No one, not even his closest advisors or favorite courtiers, was safe from his wrath. Whispers and rumors filled the corridors. Stories spread of servants disappearing overnight, of trusted nobles falling out of favor and being banished or even executed. The king's paranoia deepened, convinced that plots were everywhere, against his throne, his family, even his very life. This paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Henry's reign had always been marked by intrigue and betrayal. Yet in these final years, his suspicion intensified to almost unbearable levels. Every smile was scrutinized, every glance questioned. His wives bore the brunt of this growing fear. Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Each woman was caught in a delicate, dangerous game. A wrong word, a perceived slight, or simply falling out of favor could mean ruin or worse. The palace itself became a cage, filled with silent watchers and nervous whispers. Courtiers learned to smile when the king was pleased and disappear when he was not. Even the music and laughter that once filled the royal court grew muted, replaced by cautious steps and anxious glances. Henry's court, once a dazzling center of Renaissance culture and politics, had become a kingdom ruled not just by the king's laws, but by the shadow of fear. It was a palace where trust was scarce, loyalty was fragile, and the cost of a misstep could be deadly. And at the heart of it all sat Henry, a king imprisoned not only by his failing body, but by the growing darkness in his mind. By this stage, Henry's marriages were not romantic endeavors. They were tools of state, blunt, transactional, and disposable. The court had already been reshaped by fear, but inside the king's private chambers, fear took on another form: unpredictability. The same ruler who once penned sonnets now issued death warrants to women he had once called his queens. If a wife failed to deliver a son, or simply failed to keep his attention, she was swept aside. Politically, and sometimes literally, their heads rolled. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, had been too pious, too immovable. She aged while Henry sought renewal. Her failure to produce a surviving male heir was not merely a personal disappointment. It was, in Henry's mind, a threat to dynastic stability. She was discarded, and with her, the old alliance with Spain. The Church of England was born in the wreckage of that union, not out of conviction, but necessity. Anne Boleyn, his so-called passion, was once a symbol of transformation, but soon became an inconvenient reminder of promises unkept. She too failed to bear him a son. When whispers of flirtation became accusations of treason, adultery, and incest, Henry needed no convincing. The machinery of execution turned, and Anne's head was taken from her shoulders by a French swordsman. Jane Seymour gave him a son and promptly died. Henry mourned, but not deeply enough to remain unwed for long. Anne of Cleves arrived next, a diplomatic arrangement he found physically revolting. The marriage was annulled with speed. Catherine Howard followed, young, unwise, and eventually unfaithful. She died screaming, her crime a mirror of Anne Boleyn's. Last came Catherine Parr, more nurse than queen, whose primary achievement was survival. Each wife revealed something about Henry's needs, his insecurities, and his desperation for legacy. But none were mourned in truth. Their ends were not the heartbreak of a tragic novel, but the logical consequence of Henry's withering tolerance for disobedience, infertility, or inconvenience. What broke in these marriages was not Henry's heart. It was the illusion that England's monarchy remained guided by affection, principle, or God. By now, the only enduring union left was between the king and his absolute will. By now, the king's world had shrunk to a narrow, suffocating space, defined entirely by his obsession with control. Henry VIII's once vigorous body was ravaged by disease and neglect. His legs, swollen and ulcerated, exuded a foul stench that no amount of treatment could hide. Each step was an ordeal, and walking long distances was impossible. The once tall, broad-shouldered figure who had dominated tournaments and battlefields was now a shadow, his bloated frame tethered to a throne that seemed as much a prison as a seat of power. Yet within his deteriorating body, Henry's mind burned with relentless intensity. He still saw himself as England's architect and absolute master, the living embodiment of divine will. The king no longer rode horses or wielded weapons. He was confined indoors, his movements sluggish and limited. But his desire to control the kingdom had not diminished. It had only sharpened into something far more dangerous. Paranoia consumed him. He suspected betrayal everywhere, real or imagined. Allies who had served loyally were branded traitors overnight. Men like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, once pillars of Henry's court, were abruptly cast down, imprisoned, and executed with brutal finality. Proximity to the king became a perilous position. One misstep, a cautious word turned suspicious, could seal a noble's fate. Fear was the currency of survival. The royal court twisted itself into a grotesque performance. Courtiers no longer dared offer honest counsel or speak inconvenient truths. Instead, They became mere shadows of themselves, echoing the king's fears and affirming his delusions. Silence was safer than dissent. Flattery replaced wisdom. The palace echoed with hollow compliance. Religious upheaval mirrored this dangerous madness. Henry had severed ties with the Catholic Church and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This move was less about faith and more about control. The king's shifting suspicions dictated religious policy. Reformers one day, Catholics the next, both suffered equally under his capricious decrees. Doctrine was wielded not as a spiritual guide, but as a weapon to suppress dissent and tighten his grip. He demanded unity, yet bred division, ruled through fear, yet feared his own subjects. The England he shaped was a kingdom fractured by mistrust and terror, reflecting the fractured monarch who ruled it. No longer the charismatic Renaissance prince, Henry VIII had become a tyrant ensnared in his own delusions, a ruler who mistook obedience for love, silence for loyalty, and absolute power for divine right. He did not govern with foresight or justice. Instead, he governed against shadows, haunted by enemies born from his own fractured mind. In that haunting, he became a ghost himself, a specter ruling a kingdom consumed by fear. The final years of Henry VIII's life were a shadowy reflection of the king he once was, a man who had been full of vigor, ambition, and fiery passion, now worn down by time, illness, and the weight of his own obsessions. Imagine the once mighty monarch, whose presence had filled grand halls and battlefields alike, now confined largely to his chambers, moving with difficulty and surrounded by a court that no longer felt like home, but a gilded prison. His body had betrayed him utterly. The festering wound in his leg refused to heal, turning into a grotesque reminder of his mortality. Pain, both physical and emotional, dominated his days and nights. Gone were the days when Henry could ride out hunting or joust with his knights. Instead, he was often bedridden or transported on a litter, a pale shadow of the robust king who had once commanded armies and sparked religious revolutions. His size, which had ballooned over the years due to inactivity and health complications like diabetes and possibly gout, made movement even more painful and taxing. But it wasn't just his body that was failing. Henry's mind was also in decline, clouded by the constant pain and by the dark thoughts that plagued him. The paranoia that had begun years earlier grew stronger, and with it came harsh decrees and swift punishments aimed at anyone he suspected of disloyalty or treachery. His relationships with his children became even more complicated. Edward, his young son and heir, was still a fragile boy under the watchful eyes of tutors and advisors. Mary and Elizabeth, his daughters, were both caught in the complicated religious and political upheavals he had helped ignite, their futures uncertain in a kingdom still torn between Catholicism and the new Protestant faith. The weight of securing his dynasty rested heavily on Henry's shoulders. His obsession with his legacy never wavered, and his health problems only intensified his desperation. Despite his frailty, Henry remained fiercely proud and unyielding, often issuing commands and ruling with an iron fist until his very last days. Yet behind the tough exterior, there were glimpses of a man who knew his time was running out, who perhaps felt the burden of the path he had carved for England and for his family. Courtiers whispered of a king who, in quieter moments, reflected on his past mistakes and lost loves, haunted by what could have been. The palace halls grew quieter as Henry's strength ebbed away. The grandeur faded, replaced by a somber mood that recognized the end of an era was near. In these final years, Henry VIII was not just a king fighting for survival, but a man confronting the toll of his choices, his ambitions, and the unforgiving passage of time. In those final years, Henry VIII's once ironclad grip on England grew more desperate as his body betrayed him utterly. The vigorous, commanding figure who had roamed battlefields and courts alike was now confined to a throne barely able to bear his grotesquely swollen frame. His face, once a symbol of regal strength and youthful charisma, had distorted into a swollen mask of pain and decay. His breath came in ragged gasps, foul and labored, a stark contrast to the booming voice that once echoed through Westminster halls. The king who had commanded armies, reshaped religions, and shattered alliances was now a prisoner of his own failing flesh. a tragic monument to the merciless passage of time. But physical decline was only one aspect of his humiliation. The more his body weakened, the more his power unraveled beneath the surface. Once respected and feared, Henry became an object of whispered scorn within his own court. Ministers and nobles, who had once scrambled to please or fear him, began to regard him with a cold detachment. Foreign ambassadors no longer sent glowing reports, but speculated openly about the fragility of the English throne. Paranoia gnawed at the king's mind. Phantom enemies lurked everywhere, and loyalty was a fragile illusion. His decrees still commanded obedience, but that obedience was brittle, motivated by fear rather than respect. The king's paranoia turned the court into a theater of suspicion, where sycophants whispered lies to appease his fragile ego, and even a misstep in speech could mean a sudden, violent fall from grace. Even those closest to him contributed to his humiliation. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was a survivor, adept at navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. Her care was cautious, more calculated than compassionate, as she watched the king's slow descent with a measured wariness. Henry's children, once terrified subjects, had learned to keep their distance, their eyes on the prize that would come after their father's inevitable demise. The palace itself, once a radiant symbol of Tudor power and splendor, became a shadowed tomb where the king's every breath was a reminder of decay and defeat. Gone were the days of jousts and celebrations, now only silence and dread remained. When Henry VIII finally died, it was not with the triumphant roar of a conqueror, nor the dignity of a monarch whose legacy would inspire generations. Instead, he slipped away amid whispered rumors, growing resentment, and a nation worn thin by years of turmoil and tyranny. His final humiliation was complete. A once mighty king, brought low not by a rival's sword, but by his own excess, cruelty, and frailty. No monarch in English history had fallen so far, so thoroughly undone by the very crown he wore. Yet even in death, Henry's shadow loomed large, a dark testament to the peril of unchecked ambition, reminding all who followed that power without restraint is ultimately fragile and fleeting. Henry VIII's death marked the end of an era, but the legacy he left was far from the triumphant saga of greatness he once imagined. Instead, it was a fractured kingdom, scarred by religious upheaval, political terror, and the ruthless consolidation of absolute authority. The England he bequeathed was a land forever altered, no longer governed by the steady hand of custom or reason, but ruled through fear, suspicion, and brutal power wielded like a weapon. His reign fundamentally reshaped the monarchy, elevating the king from a figurehead among nobles to a near-divine sovereign whose will was law. But this transformation came at a catastrophic cost. The loyalty once earned through respect and leadership gave way to obedience forced by fear. Counsel became a dangerous game, suspicion poisoned relationships, and blood was spilled in the name of securing obedience. The institutions Henry ravaged, the church, parliament, and nobility, bore deep wounds that festered for generations. The seeds of instability he planted would germinate into decades of conflict and upheaval. Yet, amidst all the betrayal, destruction, and cruelty, Henry's name echoed through history, not as a wise or just ruler, but as a relentless force, an iron fist cloaked in regal splendor. He was a king who bent a nation to his will through intimidation and violence, shattering families and alliances alike in his unyielding quest for control. His vanity forged chains that bound a kingdom to his whims, and those chains would tighten long after his death. His final years, grotesque, paranoid, isolated, stand as a stark prophecy. Power without restraint consumes itself. Henry VIII's tomb holds no glory, no peace. It carries only the weight of ruin, a brutal reminder that absolute power, no matter how grand, devours the very soul that commands it. In death, Henry VIII became more than a man. He became a warning, a chilling whisper echoing through the corridors of history. Absolute power destroys all, even the king who wields it. A crown glitters brightest on a child's head, but behind the gold lies silence. For centuries, royal daughters were currency, traded across empires, veiled in silk and wed to strangers. Too young to choose, too valuable to ignore, they became pawns in dynastic games. Some obeyed, some resisted, a few rewrote history. These are not fairy tales, but chronicles of survival, where girlhood ended at the altar. From France to the Mongol steppe, Denmark to Constantinople, they wore crowns like armor. Their names are whispered in footnotes, their pain buried beneath titles. But the truth remains, every crown has a cost. She was 15, a princess of Spain, raised among crusades and cathedrals. Her name, Catherine of Aragon. Her destiny, England. Her mission, to marry the crown prince, Arthur Tudor. Arthur was also 15, frail, pale, and groomed as heir to a shaky dynasty. Their marriage was no love story. It was a pact, an alliance between two kingdoms, sealed by two children who could barely sign their names. The wedding took place in 1501. A golden gown, Spanish lace, thousands watching. But behind the pageantry lay something colder, uncertainty, fear, and ignorance. After the celebration, they were sent to Ludlow Castle, alone. No parents, no advisors, only duty and expectation. Within months, they fell ill. Fever, blood, dread. Arthur died. Catherine survived. A widow at 16, with no husband, no status, no future. But her story didn't end there. She stayed in England. She claimed the marriage had never been consummated, that in the eyes of God, she was still untouched. She waited, she prayed, and in time, she married Arthur's younger brother, Henry VIII. For years, they were happy, until the throne demanded an heir, and Catherine could not deliver. The night in Ludlow, that one marriage, that one unanswered question, returned like a ghost. Had she told the truth? Had she lied? What followed wasn't just a divorce, it was a rupture. England broke from Rome, Europe split apart, and it all began with two teenagers, a wedding in gold, and a question never truly resolved. Catherine became a queen, but the price was her youth, her dignity, and in the end, her crown. She was 6 days old when her father died. With his final breath, Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland. A crown heavier than her cradle, inherited before her first smile. At 5, she was sent to France, not for safety, but for strategy. Raised at court, draped in silk, trained to charm. Her fate was already sealed, to marry the French heir, Francis. He was a year younger, delicate, shy, and always ill. Together, they were royal children shaped into tools for empires. At 15, Mary became a bride. The wedding was a spectacle at Notre Dame. White satin, silver embroidery, she looked like an angel. But this was no fairy tale. Francis recoiled from crowds, his health declining. Mary, taller and sharper, navigated court life with poise. She brought more than grace, she brought acclaim. Through Tudor blood, she was a threat to England's throne. In 1559, a freak accident killed France's king, a shattered lance to the eye. Suddenly, Francis and Mary were king and queen, Scotland, France, and maybe England, all in the hands of teenagers. But power built on sickness rarely lasts. 17 months later, Francis was dead. An ear infection, a brain abscess. History is unsure. Mary was 17, a double widow, wearing 2 crowns and no protection. The French court turned cold. Catherine de' Medici, Francis's mother, seized power. Mary, now a foreign inconvenience, was cast out. She returned to Scotland, a land she barely knew, to rule a kingdom torn by religion and greed. Her future would spiral into scandal, betrayal, and eventually the axe. But it began here. A child bride, a sickly boy king, and a marriage dressed in diamonds, but forged in silence. She was crowned before she could crawl, but her fall would echo for centuries. She was 6 years old, a princess of France, daughter of King Charles VI, born into a court of opulence, but haunted by madness and war. Her name, Isabella of Valois. Her fate, to stop the 100 Years' War with her tiny hands. In 1396, peace was fragile. Treaties cracked like old glass. England and France needed something symbolic, something binding. So they offered a child. Her groom, King Richard II of England. He was 29, a widower, desperate for legitimacy. His throne wobbled beneath him, enemies circling. He needed a French alliance. What he got was a child bride. The marriage caused outrage. Even in an age where royal unions ignored love, a 6-year-old girl marrying a grown man shocked the court. Yet the wedding went ahead. In Calais, little Isabella was dressed in white and gold, a peace offering wrapped in brocade. Chroniclers say Richard tried to comfort her, promising, "You are my wife now, and I will be good to you." He vowed not to touch her until she was older, a gallant promise, but one laced with discomfort. He brought her to England, gave her dolls, jewels, governesses. But it wasn't love, it was theater. A child queen for a fractured kingdom. For a moment, it worked. The people adored the innocent French princess, but it didn't last. 2 years later, Richard left for Ireland. While he was gone, Henry Bolingbroke returned with an army. The crown fell. Richard was imprisoned and likely murdered. Isabella was 8, no longer a queen, just a political pawn. France demanded her return. England resisted. When she finally crossed the Channel, it was without status, without power. She would marry again, by choice this time. But she died at 19, barely older than a child, remembered not as a queen, but as the price of peace. She was 12, small, solemn, born into a kingdom torn by war. Her name, Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of royalty through John of Gaunt. Her future was already chosen. She would not be a child. She would be a vessel for legacy, for power, for the Tudor name. Her husband was Edmund Tudor in his mid-20s, ambitious, politically shrewd, and determined to plant a claim to the throne. Their marriage was not a union, it was a strategy. And Margaret, barely out of childhood, was given no say. At 13, she was pregnant. Her body, still delicate, was forced to carry the weight of England's future. The pregnancy was brutal. Some said she screamed through the night. Others wrote she could hardly walk again. On January 28, 1457, in the cold stone walls of Pembroke Castle, she gave birth to a son, Henry Tudor, her only child. But survival came at a cost. The birth left her physically broken. She would never have another child. A girl asked to do a woman's work had paid the price in blood and bone. Before Henry was born, Edmund died, likely of plague, imprisoned in Wales. Margaret became a widow at 13, a mother and alone, surrounded by men who saw her as a pawn, but underestimated her entirely. She never remarried for love, never bore another heir. Instead, she built alliances, plotted in silence, and kept her son's claim alive through decades of danger. When the crown finally fell to Henry at Bosworth in 1485, it was Margaret's victory too. She had forged a king from her pain. She signed her letters, Margaret R., the king's mother. But before the power came the blood. Before the dynasty, a child, and before the crown, a girl who nearly died to make it. She was 14, a Habsburg archduchess raised on minuets and military discipline, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa. Her name, Marie Antoinette. Her fate, France. Her mission, to marry the Dauphin, Louis Auguste, heir to the Bourbon throne. He was 15, awkward, soft-spoken, more at ease with keys and locks than with conversation. Their marriage was a political bridge between old enemies, Austria and France. But beneath the embroidery and powdered wigs, disaster was already brewing. The moment she crossed the French border, her Austrian identity was stripped away. Her clothes, her language, even her dog, gone. She was remade as the future Queen of France. Their wedding was lavish, but the marriage was brittle. Louis was shy, possibly suffering from a condition that made intimacy difficult. For 7 years, their union remained unconsummated. The court gossiped, pamphlets mocked. Marie, still a teenager, was painted as cold, frivolous, even promiscuous. Versailles was not home, it was theater. Her loneliness became legend. In 1774, the old king died. At 19 and 20, Louis and Marie became king and queen, children on a crumbling throne. Marie turned to distractions, fashion, balls, impossible hairstyles. The people turned against her. "Let them eat cake," they claimed she said. She didn't, but the damage was done. As France starved, her image became the face of excess. The revolution rose, the Bastille fell, and the golden cage shattered. In 1793, at 37, she walked to the guillotine. No jewels, no powdered wig, just the shadow of the 14-year-old girl who once crossed the border into a kingdom that would destroy her. Her marriage was meant to unite nations. Instead, it lit the match of revolution. Marie Antoinette came to France as a bride. She left as a warning. She was 18, crowned Queen of Egypt, last in a long line of rulers descended from Ptolemy, Alexander the Great's general. Her name, Cleopatra VII. Her kingdom, fragile. Her fate, shared. For her father had decreed she must rule with and marry her younger brother. He was 10. Ptolemy the 13th, a boy king, guided by ruthless advisors who saw Cleopatra not as a sister, but as a threat. The marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even about family. It was about dynasty, keeping bloodlines pure and power controlled. But Cleopatra would not be controlled. She refused to share authority, issued decrees in her own name, placed her image alone on coins. She even learned Egyptian, something no ruler of her line had done. That made her dangerous. The palace in Alexandria became a battlefield of whispers. Factions rose. The court turned. In 49 BCE, she was forced to flee. Across the desert, disguised, she gathered troops. A queen in exile, but not defeated. Then came Caesar. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt to mediate the siblings' feud. Cleopatra didn't walk into his court. She had herself smuggled in, rolled inside a rug, and dramatically unwrapped before him. It worked. Charm, intellect, strategy. He was captivated. War followed. Caesar backed Cleopatra. Alexandria burned. And in the chaos, Ptolemy XIII drowned trying to escape, just 13 years old. Cleopatra returned to the throne, alone this time. She would rule with Caesar's son, then later with Mark Antony. Her name became legend, but it began with a brother-husband, a power struggle, and a rug that changed history. Cleopatra was not born a goddess. She became one through fire, cunning, and defiance. She was still a girl when her marriage was arranged. Her name, Matilda of Flanders. Her future tied to an ambitious duke known as William the Bastard. He was illegitimate, fierce, and determined to claim not just Normandy, but England. Their union was more than a match. It was a gamble. A noblewoman of impeccable lineage paired with a man born on the wrong side of a royal bed. Many whispered she would never accept him. At first, she didn't. Legend says Matilda rejected William, that he responded not with flowers, but fury, riding to her father's court, dragging her from her horse by her braids. Fact or myth, what followed was real. She married him, on her own terms, and she did not marry lightly. Matilda was no passive duchess. She governed Normandy in William's absence. She signed charters, managed armies, and ran the court. When William sailed to conquer England in 1066, it was Matilda who secured his rear, politically, financially, and with the loyalty of Normandy's elite. While he fought at Hastings, she ruled at home. When news came of William's victory, it wasn't just his triumph, it was hers. She was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey in 1068. The first of her line. A queen forged not by inheritance, but by alliance, strength, and strategy. Their marriage, though marked by fire and ambition, was enduring. Together they founded a dynasty that would shape England for generations. But behind that dynasty stood the girl from Flanders, clever, proud, and never meant to be silent. Matilda married a bastard duke. She crowned a king, and in doing so, became the quiet architect of conquest. In the glittering labyrinth of the Russian court, where brides were bartered and power passed through marriage beds, one woman chose a different path. Her name, Sofia Alexeyevna, daughter of Tsar Alexis, sister to two future czars, a Romanov by birth, but a ruler by will. She never married. In a world where royal daughters were defined by alliances, Sofia defied custom. Intelligent, politically astute, and deeply educated, she refused to be sold into a foreign court or bound to a nobleman. Instead, she reached for something forbidden: power. In 1682, the Russian throne teetered. Her brother Fyodor was dead. Her half-brothers, one sickly, one a child named Peter, left a vacuum. Through a coup backed by the Streltsy Guard, Sofia installed herself as regent. Officially, she ruled in the name of her brothers. In practice, she ruled alone. She sat behind a double throne with Ivan and Peter as puppets. She negotiated treaties, quelled rebellions, and reshaped Russia's foreign policy. But behind her courtly poise, resentment brewed. A woman with power was already a scandal. A woman with power and no husband, a threat. She built her court around loyal women, avoided marriage entirely, and cultivated the image of Russia's guiding hand. But Peter grew older and bolder. At 17, he seized control. The Streltsy turned. Sofia was imprisoned in a convent, her name stripped from state records, her influence erased. She died decades later, uncrowned, unmarried, and unheard. But for 7 years, Russia was ruled by a woman who refused to wed. Not a bride, not a wife. A czarina who wore no crown, but held the reins of an empire. Sofia chose power over partnership, and in doing so, rewrote the rules, if only briefly. She was 12 when the crown was placed on her head. Hedwig of Poland, daughter of Louis the Great of Hungary, descended from kings and saints. But she wasn't born to rule Poland, until politics changed everything. Her elder sister was passed over. A male heir never came, and so the crown fell on Hedwig's small shoulders, a child queen in a kingdom at a crossroads. In 1385, Poland faced threats on all sides. The answer came from the east, a union with Lithuania. But there was a cost. Hedwig was to marry the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila. He was 26, pagan, foreign, and not the man she loved. She had been betrothed to William of Austria, a boy she knew, perhaps even adored, but love held no weight in the cold calculations of state. Jogaila promised conversion, unity, protection. The Polish lords demanded the match. Hedwig wept. Legend says she tried to break down the castle doors with an axe to escape her fate. But in the end, she relented. For her people. At 13, she married Jogaila, now baptized Władysław. Their union created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the largest political entities in Europe. It was a diplomatic miracle, born from the sacrifice of a girl. Hedwig ruled not as consort, but as monarch in her own right. She founded schools, protected the poor, and reformed law. Her reign was short, but luminous. She died in childbirth at 25, her only child lost with her. But her memory lived. In 1997, she was canonized as a saint. Hedwig gave her life, her love, her body, for a nation. She was not just a queen, she was a cornerstone. She entered the Forbidden City as a teenage concubine, one among many, unremarkable, silent, selected to serve the emperor's pleasure. Her name, Cixi. Born into a fading Manchu noble family, she had no power, no title, only ambition. She learned quickly. In 1856, she gave birth to a son, the emperor's only heir. That changed everything. From concubine, she became consort Yi. From background figure, she became a mother to a future emperor. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, his son was 5. Cixi, still in her 20s, made her move. She joined forces with the emperor's widow and staged a coup. Ministers were arrested, rivals exiled, and the child emperor was placed under her regency. But Cixi didn't sit on the throne. She ruled from behind a silk screen, literally. In court audiences, she listened, decided, commanded, all while hidden. It was a compromise with tradition, but she was no puppet. For over 4 decades, she controlled the Qing dynasty. Through 2 emperors, rebellions, foreign invasions, and reform crises, she maneuvered with ruthless brilliance. She modernized China's military, built railways, and navigated the twilight of empire with steel and silk gloves. Yet her image remains divided, a scheming despot to some, a savior to others. She never remarried, never left the court. She built her world inside palace walls and controlled the fate of a nation from within them. Cixi began as a girl chosen to serve. She became the woman who ruled an empire, not from a throne, not from a battlefield, but from behind a screen, with power sharper than any sword. 10 stories, 10 girls, each draped in silk, crowned in gold, and handed over like signatures on a treaty. They came from different lands, Poland, France, China, Egypt. They lived in castles, courts, and palaces, but their fate was shared. They were daughters, not yet women, asked to carry nations on their shoulders. Some ruled with fire, others vanished into footnotes, a few became legends, but none escaped the cost. These weren't fairy tales, they were sacrifices. For every crown, a lost childhood. For every alliance, a broken heart. Behind dynasties and empires lie the bodies of girls who never got to choose. Brides who became warriors, queens who lived in silence, empresses who ruled in shadows. History remembers kings who conquered, but we must also remember the girls who were conquered first. By duty, by marriage, by the heavy hand of history. Because power doesn't always look like a sword. Sometimes it looks like a veil. The air inside Linlithgow Palace is heavy with the scent of damp stone and dying embers. Shadows flicker across ancient walls as torches sputter in their brackets. Footsteps echo down the narrow corridor, rapid, panicked, relentless. A man in royal livery, breath ragged, pushes forward. His boots strike the cold flagstones like a war drum. Something has ended. Something must begin. He stops outside a door carved with the royal crest. Behind it, silence reigns, broken only by the gentle stirrings of a mother and her newborn child. He composes himself, just barely. Then, with trembling hands, he pushes the door open. Marie de Guise turns from the cradle, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The infant stirs in soft blankets, unaware of the world now resting on her tiny shoulders. "My lady," the man begins, bowing low. "The king is dead." The words fall like a sword. Marie clutches the edge of the crib. "Your daughter is now Queen of Scotland." Outside, the bells of the chapel begin to toll, one after another, a mournful rhythm to usher in an uncertain age. It is December 1542. Scotland has no king. It has a queen who cannot yet hold her head up. She has inherited a fractured realm, surrounded by enemies and uneasy allies. At the center of it all, an infant's cry echoes through the stone halls, rising above the sound of tolling bells. A new reign has begun, shrouded in death, prophecy, and danger. And so begins the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, whose story will weave through empires, betrayals, forbidden love, and fatal ambition, until it ends in silence, under the cold gaze of another queen's justice. The cradle rocks gently. History shifts. The queen has been born. Sunlight pours through stained glass, casting crimson and gold across the stone floor of the council chamber. Marie de Guise stands at the head of the table, the weight of the crown not on her brow, but in her blood. Around her sit Scotland's Catholic lords, noblemen sworn to protect the infant queen, yet restless with fear and ambition. "My lady," one speaks, voice low and urgent. "Henry VIII has heard of the king's death. He will act quickly. He wants your daughter in English hands." Marie's eyes narrow. Across the chamber, a herald lays a letter on the table. Its seal bears the unmistakable symbol of the Tudor rose. "He proposes a union," another regent says bitterly. "His son Edward, to our queen, A betrothal in name, a conquest in truth. Murmurs ripple through the council like wind through dry grass. The English king is no ordinary threat. A Protestant monarch with fire in his eyes and blood on his hands, Henry sees Scotland as vulnerable prey. Marie glances down at the sleeping child in her arms. Her daughter, her legacy, her crown. She will not marry Edward, Marie says firmly. Not while I draw breath. One lord leans forward. Then we must seek aid. France, the Pope, anyone who will keep England at bay. Marie nods slowly. The child is queen, but I am her mother. I will guide her until she can defend her own throne. If Henry means to challenge us, we must find allies who will die before letting him win. Outside, a raven takes flight from the palace walls, a dark silhouette against a cold northern sky. Inside, the queen stirs in her cradle. Already the battles for her crown have begun. The wind howls across the Scottish coast, carrying with it the salt of the sea and the scent of coming change. At the docks, a crowd gathers, cloaked nobles, weeping maids, stern soldiers. All eyes are on the ship that waits in the harbor, sails snapping like banners of fate. Marie de Guise holds her daughter close, her arms wrapped tightly around the bundled infant queen. Mary is just 5 years old, her cheeks rosy, her wide eyes filled with confusion. She doesn't understand yet what it means to leave her homeland, her mother, her people. My darling, Marie whispers, brushing a curl from Mary's face. You must be brave. You are going to France, not just to be safe, but to become strong. Around them, the advisors murmur, watching the moment unfold like a scene from a tragedy. They all know the truth. This is no simple visit. It is a calculated move, one final hope to shield Mary from England's grasp. The French court has agreed. Mary will be raised among them, groomed to marry the Dauphin, Francis, a queen for their prince, a daughter for their nation. Marie steps back as the wind tugs at her cloak. Mary is lifted onto the ship by gentle hands. She doesn't cry, yet. She only turns, looking back until her mother is a silhouette against the gray sky. Marie stands motionless as the ship pulls away, her heart fracturing in silence. Behind her, the nobles whisper of duty and strategy, but Marie feels only the raw pain of separation. She has sent her daughter across the sea, into the arms of foreign kings, to protect a throne draped in shadow. For the queen to survive, she must first learn to reign in exile. The waves rise and Scotland fades. The morning mist clings to the shoreline like a veil of sorrow. The ship creaks softly as it bobs in the tide, ropes groaning against the pull of the sea. From the hills above, Linlithgow Palace stands distant, its towers blurred by the fog. Scotland watches silently as one of its own prepares to leave. Mary stands on the deck, her small hand wrapped tightly around her mother's fingers. Marie de Guise's jaw is set, but her eyes are wet. Around them, attendants and courtiers bustle with trunks and farewells. Yet time seems frozen for the mother and child, two figures suspended between past and future. The wind catches Mary's red cloak, snapping it behind her like a royal banner. She looks out over the waves, unaware of the history she carries. She is just a girl, and yet, in her tiny frame, two kingdoms hold their breath. My sweet girl, Marie says, kneeling beside her. This journey will take us far, but your spirit must remain strong. France is not home, but it is our hope. The gangplank is drawn. The ship groans, sails unfurling like wings. As it begins to drift from the dock, the nobles on the shore raise gloved hands in solemn farewell. Some bow, others wipe their eyes. Mary turns to wave, her small face pale against the gray horizon. Marie wraps her arms around her daughter and holds her close, knowing this moment may never come again. The sea stretches endlessly ahead, an uncertain road to an uncertain future. By nightfall, Scotland is gone, and though mother and daughter share this voyage, only one will return. For in France, destiny waits with open arms. A crown, a marriage, a war yet to come. The ship sails on, leaving behind tears and the cradle of a kingdom. The Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye rises like a dream from the French countryside, its grand halls filled with music, laughter, and the scent of fresh blossoms. Here, far from the chill of Scottish winds, Mary begins a new life, one wrapped in silk, Latin verse, and courtly etiquette. Tutors line the marble corridors, each more gifted than the last. Mary learns languages like songs, French, Latin, Italian, Spanish. Her mind absorbs everything: poetry, politics, dance, diplomacy. She rides horses with poise, debates philosophers with fire. The girl who once slept under tartan now walks beside dukes and cardinals. But amid the lessons and rituals, there is one constant: Francis. Delicate and soft-spoken, the young Dauphin is unlike his father, the stern King Henri II. Francis prefers books to battles, music to marches. And in Mary he finds not only a companion, but an equal. They wander the palace gardens together, play chess by candlelight, and trade whispered dreams of what ruling might one day be. "Do you ever miss Scotland?" Francis asks one evening. Mary smiles, eyes fixed on the twilight sky. "Only when I dream, but I believe I was always meant to be here." The French court embraces her as one of their own. Her beauty becomes legend, tall, graceful, with auburn hair and a voice that charms even the coldest noble. But it is her mind, her wit, her presence that captivate most. She is no longer just the child queen of a troubled land. She is a future queen consort of France, the jewel of two kingdoms, raised in the elegance of Versailles, but tempered by Scottish iron. As the years pass, Mary blossoms, not just into a woman, but into a force of destiny. In France, the girl becomes a monarch, and soon a bride. The bells of Notre Dame toll across Paris, their thunderous song echoing through cobbled streets and golden rooftops. The city is alive with celebration. Crowds press into every corner, shouting blessings, tossing petals, and raising goblets in tribute. Today, two thrones are joined beneath heaven's gaze. Inside the cathedral, the air is heavy with incense and expectation. Sunlight pours through stained glass windows, casting jewels of light upon the assembled nobility. Robes shimmer, jewels sparkle, and eyes turn to the grand aisle. Mary enters, radiant in white and gold, her auburn hair adorned with pearls and lace. She moves with quiet confidence, her steps echoing on the ancient stones. At the altar stands Francis, nervous, slight, but deeply devoted. His eyes never leave hers. As the priest begins, Latin chants swirl around them, sacred and somber. This is more than a wedding. It is a declaration of power. Scotland and France, united by faith, bonded by blood. Together, they will stand against the tide of Protestant reform sweeping through Europe. Vows are spoken, rings exchanged, a kiss seals the union. The cathedral erupts in applause. Outside, fireworks explode above the Seine. Courtiers dance in candlelit halls. Mary and Francis, hand in hand, retreat to a private chamber where titles fall away, and only two young hearts remain. But in the shadows of celebration, whispers stir. England watches with unease. The union strengthens Catholic power, and with Mary's claim to the English crown, the alliance sends tremors through Queen Elizabeth's court. Yet for now, none of that matters. Tonight, Mary is not just a Queen of Scots, she is Queen of France. And in the arms of Francis, beneath the velvet canopy of royal promise, she feels, for a fleeting moment, safe, loved, and unbreakable. History, however, has other plans. The skies over Paris are gray, heavy with mourning. The bells that once rang in celebration now toll in sorrow. Inside the palace, the halls are hushed. Tapestries are drawn, servants whisper, and the scent of roses, once fresh, now hangs like a ghost in the air. Mary kneels beside the bed of Francis. His face, pale and still, is barely recognizable from the boy she once knew. The infection came swiftly, an ache in his ear that grew into fever, delirium, silence. Not even the finest physicians of France could save the young king. She clutches his hand, but it is cold. Her husband, her friend, her crown, gone. Francis is just 16. Mary, only 18, stands cloaked in widow's black before a world that once adored her. Now she is a queen without a country. The French court, once warm and welcoming, has grown cold. Power shifts swiftly here. Catherine de' Medici, Francis's mother, moves quickly to secure her remaining son, Charles IX, on the throne. There is no place left for Mary. A quiet decision is made. She will return to Scotland. She boards the ship in silence, the same sea now dark and brooding. France fades behind her like a dream turned nightmare. Ahead lies the land of her birth, a place she barely remembers. A kingdom changed, a people divided. Scotland is no longer the Catholic stronghold she left. Protestantism now dominates, and her French upbringing is a source of suspicion. Yet she carries herself like a queen, veiled in sorrow, but not defeat. As the Scottish coast emerges from the mist, Mary steels herself. She returns not as a child, nor a bride, but a widow with fire in her heart. She has buried a king. Now, she must learn to rule alone. Scotland greets its queen not with fanfare, but with suspicion. As Mary steps ashore in Leith, the salt wind tangling her veil, the people gather to see the woman raised in French silk now standing on their rugged soil. Her beauty is undeniable, her poise regal. But beneath every bowed head is a question. Whose queen is she truly? The Scotland Mary left behind is gone. In her absence, the Reformation has swept through the land like wildfire. Churches stripped bare, priests driven into exile. The sermons now speak John Knox's name louder than Christ's, and Knox himself, sharp-eyed and unrelenting, watches Mary's return like a hawk circling above. She wears the face of a queen, he whispers to his followers, but her soul carries Rome. Still, the nobles ride to greet her, some out of loyalty, others out of ambition. They smile, swear allegiance, and wait for her to falter. The royal court she reestablishes in Edinburgh is elegant, but cautious. Mary brings musicians, scholars, and advisors from France, creatures of a world her people no longer trust. Even her own council is fractured. Catholic allies press for old ways. Protestant lords speak of moderation, but sharpen their knives behind closed doors. Mary listens, nods, smiles. But each decision she makes feels like a wager, on peace, on power, on survival. One evening, Mary stands at her window overlooking the city. Torches flicker below. Somewhere, church bells ring. Somewhere, Knox is preaching her downfall. "I am their queen," she murmurs. "But am I one of them?" In a land carved by belief and blood, Mary must now walk a razor's edge. One step wrong, and she could fall, not just from grace, but from history. The throne is hers, but the country may never be. The wedding bells ring out across Edinburgh, but there is little joy beneath their chime. Mary, Queen of Scots, takes Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, as her husband. The match seems perfect on paper. He is tall, handsome, of noble blood, and like Mary, a Catholic with a claim to the English throne. Their union should unite factions, solidify the Stuart line, and bring peace. But appearances are deceiving. From the beginning, Darnley's charm rots into arrogance. He demands the crown matrimonial, equal rule beside Mary, and bristles at being excluded from matters of state. "I am a king," he says, pounding his fist on the council table. But Mary meets him with cold fire in her eyes. "You are nothing without me," she replies. "Never forget that." Whispers swirl through the court. Darnley drinks too much, fights with nobles, and humiliates his wife in public. He suspects every man near her, especially her Italian secretary, David Rizzio. His jealousy festers, dark and dangerous. Mary tries to hold her court together, tries to smile through the cracks in her marriage, but the tension is undeniable. The nobles begin to circle, sensing weakness. Darnley, meanwhile, retreats into sulking and scheming. In private, their arguments grow vicious. "You shame me in front of my people," Mary snaps. "I see the way you look at Rizzio," Darnley growls. "Do you think I don't know?" The Queen walks away, her stomach heavy with child, her mind racing with dread. What began as a political alliance has unraveled into a personal war, and Mary, once hopeful, once radiant, now finds herself trapped beside a man she cannot trust. The crown may sit on her head, but the dagger is at her back, and it has her husband's fingerprints on the hilt. The gallery is filled with soft light and quiet conversation. Mary sits with David Rizzio, her trusted secretary, discussing matters of court beneath stained glass windows that paint the room in color. She is heavily pregnant, her hand resting on her swelling belly, the future King of Scotland stirring within. The peace shatters in an instant. The doors crash open. Darnley enters, his eyes wild, his jaw clenched, followed by armed men with drawn blades. "This ends now," he hisses. Mary rises in alarm, backing away. The soldier sees Rizzio. He clings to Mary, begging for her protection, his fingers tangled in the folds of her gown. "Do not do this," Mary cries, her voice cracking. "He is no threat. This is madness." But no one listens. Knives flash, blades plunge. Over 50 wounds are carved into Rizzio's body as he screams, then chokes, then falls silent. Blood sprays across the stone floor, staining Mary's shoes, her skirts, her soul. She stands frozen, her face pale, her breath shallow. The child inside her kicks violently. "God help us," she whispers. Darnley says nothing. He watches the murder with a twisted satisfaction, then turns and walks away. That night, the Queen locks herself in her chamber. Outside, nobles whisper of treason and madness. Inside, Mary cradles her belly, feeling the life within her fight to survive the trauma. On June 19, 1566, the halls of Edinburgh Castle echo with screams, not of war, but of birth. Mary delivers a son, James, into a world already steeped in betrayal. He is her light in the darkness, but even he cannot undo the horror of what she has endured. The blood on the floor has not yet dried, and Mary knows the worst is yet to come. The air over Edinburgh is thick with frost as Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, lies in convalescence at Kirklefield. The house is quiet, his attendants discreet, his wife absent. Mary has not visited often. Their marriage, once a political triumph, now lies in ruins, poisoned by distrust, humiliation, and blood. Still, Darnley tries to recover. He takes short walks, reads letters, gazes out at the winter sky. But whispers drift through the streets, of enemies, of revenge, of something coming. Beneath the house, barrels of gunpowder sit hidden, the fuse laid with purpose. At midnight, a flash rips through the night. The earth trembles. The house erupts into a column of flame and stone, the explosion shattering windows across the city. Smoke chokes the sky. Rubble rains down. The house at Kirklefield is gone, leveled. But Darnley's body is not found in the ruins. A search of the grounds reveals a grim discovery. In a nearby orchard, his lifeless form lies beside his servant. No burns, no wounds, both strangled. The Queen receives the news in stony silence. She does not cry. She does not protest. The court erupts with speculation. Was it Mary? Was it the Earl of Bothwell? Was it revenge for Rizzio, for betrayal, for ambition? Mary says nothing, but silence becomes guilt in the minds of her enemies. A king has died not by illness, not by war, but by cold design. And whether Mary ordered it or merely allowed it, Scotland will never look at her the same. The flames of Kirklefield may have consumed a house, but the explosion shatters more than stone. It marks the beginning of her undoing. A queen's power has never been more dangerous, and never more fragile. The smoke from Darnley's death had barely cleared when another storm gathered. Just 3 months after the explosion at Kirklefield, Mary Queen of Scots weds James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. The announcement sends shockwaves through the realm. The people whisper, the nobles rage. Even her closest allies stare in disbelief. Bothwell, brash, cunning, and rumored to have orchestrated Darnley's murder, had been her protector, her confidant. Now, he is her husband. Some say he abducted her, forced her hand. Others claim Mary went willingly, that she loved him, that she saw in him a partner strong enough to hold the crumbling throne beside her. But perception matters more than truth. To the public, it is a betrayal. To the Protestant lords, it is a provocation. To her enemies, it is the final proof that Mary was complicit in her second husband's death. Churches denounce her. Nobles begin to plot. Former supporters turn their backs. Even Catholics grow uneasy. Mary tries to maintain control, presenting her new husband as a stabilizing force. But Bothwell is no diplomat. He is reckless, feared, and increasingly despised. His swagger only deepens the divide. His presence beside the Queen poisons every room he enters. "What have you done?" one advisor whispers. "You've married ruin." Mary says nothing, but in private she weeps. This is not the future she imagined, not the crown she dreamed of. What began as a love of power is now just the fear of loss. The marriage is meant to save her. Instead, it becomes the final nail in her reputation. The Queen who once held 2 kingdoms in her hands now finds herself surrounded by enemies, by doubt, and by a husband who may bring her to ruin faster than any assassin ever could. The midsummer sun hangs low over Carberry Hill as 2 armies face each other in tense silence. On one side, Mary Queen of Scots and James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, defiant, proud, outnumbered. On the other, a coalition of nobles, Catholic and Protestant alike, united by one goal, to remove the Queen. The hill is quiet, save for the occasional clink of armor and the distant cry of birds. Mary stands tall in her saddle, dressed in black and crimson. Her eyes sweep the field, searching for a way out. But there is none. "They've turned against me," she murmurs. Bothwell draws his sword. "We can still fight." Mary shakes her head. "Not today. Not against our own countrymen." The nobles send envoys, offering terms. "Come with us peacefully," they say, "and we will spare Bothwell." Mary glances at her husband, her jaw clenched. She knows it's a lie, but she also knows they cannot win. "I will go," she says, raising her voice. "Spare him." Bothwell grips her hand for one last moment, then rides off into exile, vanishing into the haze of history. Mary dismounts and walks forward alone. The nobles part like a tide. Some bow, most do not. "You will be taken to Loch Leven Castle," one says coldly. "There you will remain until Scotland no longer suffers your rule." Loch Leven rises from the mist like a prison built from stone and sorrow. Within its cold walls, Mary is stripped of her titles, her freedom, her child. She stares from her chamber window, eyes fixed on the distant hills, her hands resting on her stomach. Twins, now lost to grief. Carberry Hill was not a battle, it was a reckoning. And the Queen, for all her titles, is now a prisoner of her own people. The night is silent at Loch Leven Castle, save for the soft splash of water and the rustle of linen. A laundress pushes a cart of soiled clothes through the corridor. Beside her walks a woman cloaked in shadows, her face hidden, arms piled with laundry. It is Mary. After nearly a year of captivity, a daring escape is in motion, masterminded by Willie Douglas and aided by loyal hearts willing to risk everything. Disguised as a servant, the former Queen slips past drowsy guards and into the waiting boat. They row across the dark waters of Loch Leven, every creak of the oars like a gunshot in the stillness. On the shore, hundreds of supporters await, their torches lighting the night like stars fallen to earth. Mary is free. By morning, her standard is raised again. Nobles gather, soldiers rally. The Queen rides at the head of her army, determined to reclaim her throne. They march toward Edinburgh with hope burning in their chests. But at Langside, that hope is shattered. On May 13, 1568, Mary's forces clash with those of James Stuart, Earl of Moray, her half-brother and regent to her son. The hills run red with blood. Swords ring, arrows fly, and shouts of war turn to cries of defeat. Mary watches from a ridge as her army crumbles. What began as a triumph becomes a massacre. She flees the battlefield, heart pounding, her cloak soaked in rain and fear. Her loyal few ride with her, faces grim. There is no way back to the throne now. Scotland is lost. With no allies left, Mary makes one final, desperate decision. She will cross into England, into the hands of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. But she is not seeking refuge. She is walking into history's trap. Rain lashes the borderlands as Mary crosses into England, her cloak heavy with water, her crown left behind in the mud of Langside. Exhausted, disheveled, and betrayed, she rides not as a queen, but as a fugitive. Each hoofbeat brings her closer to her last hope, her cousin, Elizabeth I. For years, their letters had been cordial, even affectionate. Two queens bound by blood, divided by faith. Now, Mary throws herself at Elizabeth's mercy, hoping sisterhood will outweigh politics. "I seek shelter," she writes, "not a throne, only safety." But the English court sees something else. A Catholic queen with a stronger claim to the English crown than Elizabeth herself. Whispers rise like smoke, of plots, papal blessings, and foreign armies. Elizabeth does not meet Mary in person. Instead, she sends guards. When Mary steps into Carlisle Castle, she expects protection. She finds a cell. At first, they call it protective custody, a precaution. But the locks click shut. The guards never leave. Days stretch into weeks. Letters go unanswered. Her freedom, once a promise, becomes a distant memory. From the narrow window, Mary watches the English rain fall over foreign fields. She thinks of Scotland, of France, of the crown that slipped so easily from her fingers. She was meant to be a queen of two nations, yet now she is a prisoner in both. "I am not your enemy," she writes again. "I am your kin." But Elizabeth is silent. She weighs risks. She counts threats. And above all, she watches. Mary may be in chains, but her name still stirs Catholic hearts across Europe. And for Elizabeth, that is more dangerous than any army. The sanctuary Mary sought has become her second cage, and the walls are far higher this time. The years pass in uneasy silence. Mary remains locked away, her world reduced to stone walls and watchful eyes. But beyond her prison, whispers grow louder. Across Europe, Catholic monarchs plot, bishops conspire, and underground networks pulse with a single, dangerous dream: to see Mary crowned Queen of England. Letters cross borders under false names. Secret messengers vanish into alleyways. Hidden within ordinary correspondence are coded messages, ink that vanishes, numbers that whisper death. Every failed plot is met with brutal reprisal. Every name revealed becomes a death sentence. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot is uncovered. A Florentine banker, trusted by nobles, conspires to kill Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Spanish forces stand ready to invade. The Pope gives his blessing. When the plot unravels, heads roll. Yet Mary is untouched. No proof ties her directly. Elizabeth fumes, but cannot move against her cousin. Not yet. Still, the noose tightens. Elizabeth's court passes laws to prevent Mary from ever claiming the throne, even if Elizabeth dies. The bond of association, they call it. A legal trap designed to ensure Mary's downfall if even a hint of rebellion touches her name. Mary writes letters in careful script, denying involvement, pleading innocence, but the ink stains her hands as surely as if it were blood. "I am no traitor," she says. "Only a queen denied her throne." But England doesn't forget, and neither does Elizabeth. Every message Mary sends, every visitor she greets is watched. She is a symbol, a threat, a rallying cry for the discontent. Though the sword does not yet fall, the shadow of it grows longer each day. And in the eyes of her captors, she is guilty, not by action, but by existence. The queen in chains still wears her crown in their nightmares. The summer of 1586 is heavy with heat and secrets. Deep within the estate where Mary is held, a servant slips into her chamber. He bows low, but his eyes flick with urgency. "My lady," he whispers, "I bear a letter from Anthony Babington." Mary's heart skips. She has heard the name, young, noble, Catholic, loyal to her cause. His words, encrypted and urgent, speak of rebellion. "We have 6 men ready," he writes, "to strike down Queen Elizabeth and restore you to your throne." Mary reads in silence. Her candle flickers. Outside, the cicadas drone like distant drums. She hesitates. Then she picks up her quill. Her reply is cautious, measured, but damning. "Let me see these men," she writes, "and decide if the deed can be done." The letter leaves her hand. She does not know it has already passed through others, men loyal not to her, but to Elizabeth. Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, has built a web so fine it catches shadows. The trap is sprung. When the coded messages are broken and presented to Elizabeth, she holds the page with trembling hands. At last, the justification she has waited for. Mary's own handwriting, acknowledging a plot to assassinate the Queen. Elizabeth stares out her window, torn between fear and duty. "She must be tried," she says. "Let the world see her crime." Mary denies it. She claims entrapment, manipulation. But the ink does not lie. In a world ruled by suspicion, Mary has crossed the line from symbol to threat. No longer just a queen in exile, she is now an enemy of the state. The verdict is inevitable. The death warrant waits for one more signature, and this time there will be no escape, no rescue, no letters left to send. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, walks to the scaffold in a gown of black, her veil thin as shadow. She stands tall, unbroken. "I die a true Catholic," she declares, laying her head on the block. The first blow misses, the second nearly severs, the third ends it. The executioner lifts her head and shouts, but silence clings to the room like smoke. Mary's death is not the end. It is legend. Her blood stains stone, but her story carves itself into history. Queen, prisoner, martyr, a crown lost, a legacy immortal.